Hey guys, I'm Uncle Joel with Pen and Reel, where we talk about comic books, video games, TV shows, movies, books, and more. We'll do reviews, speculation, ideas I have as a writer for what I would do if I was writing the movies or comics, and so on. Please leave a comment to let us know what you think. Really appreciate the feedback. If you like what you see, hit like and be sure to subscribe. And with that being said, on to the video. Welcome back to Star Wars 2020, where we take a look at the entirety of the Skywalker saga. So for Return of the Jedi, I decided to put aside a lot of the criticism people have, specifically in regards to the Ewoks, and just watch the movie for itself. Yes, I would have preferred the entire conflict to have taken place on Kashyyyk and have a war with the Wookiees, but I'm not considering what could have been or what should have been, and just viewing the movie as it is. So right off the bat, I have some mixed feelings about the opening crawl. On the one hand, I think I would have preferred to have the second Death Star be something of a big reveal, rather than just something thrown out in the opening crawl. And on the other hand, they do go to the second Death Star pretty quickly, so I guess it makes sense. Not the way I would have preferred it to be done, but at the same time, I guess I'm okay with it, since the movie jumps into it pretty quickly. So I think it was a really good idea to set so much of the opening of the movie on Tatooine, specifically in Jabba's palace, as it draws several things full circle from A New Hope. You get the conclusion of Han Solo's dealings with Jabba, you get Luke leaving Tatooine, knowing nothing of the Jedi and just learning, and then returning as a full-fledged Jedi. You get the further development of Leia and Han's relationship. You also see Lando returning and trying to redeem himself for the mistakes that he made. And I really appreciated Luke playing himself off as the mysterious robed figure who uses the Force to work his way into Jabba's palace, much in the same way Obi-Wan did in A New Hope, and then watching him really lean into his role as a Jedi Knight when fighting in Jabba's palace. Now, I really didn't like the way Boba Fett died. I had no problem with his jetpack going haywire and him falling in the Sarlacc pit. That was not an issue whatsoever. The issue I had was the fact that Han accidentally swung around and hit his jetpack, and that's what killed him. Now, in the original trilogy, Boba Fett didn't really play that significant of a role. He was a fairly bit character who did appear in all three movies, but I had no significant attachment to him here, so I'm okay with him being killed off here. I just didn't like the fact that he was a consistently reoccurring character, and he did appear significant, and yet he was killed off by accident. And overall, I would say the entire Jabba Palace sequence was perfect Star Wars. You see, you get this really diverse cast of characters that serves to greatly expand the world. And you get this great sense of scope just from the sheer diversity of the characters crammed into the small space. You've got so many different aliens. You have Jabba, you have droids, you have a Jedi showing up, you have adventure, you have excitement, you never know what's going to come next. There's just so much there, and you're constantly left on the edge of your seat. It's exciting, it's strange, it's mysterious, it's just perfect Star Wars. In the time that we get with Yoda and with Force Ghost to Obi-Wan, it does a few things that really make me look back at the prequel trilogy a little bit differently. One thing that we get is a bit more of that playful Yoda that I really wish was in the prequel trilogy. But then also, when Obi-Wan is talking to Luke and advising him, he tells Luke to bury his feelings. The advice that Obi-Wan gives here is quite consistent with the Jedi Council and the entire Jedi Order that we see in the prequel trilogy. So on the one hand, we get a little bit of inconsistent character presentation, but on the other hand, with Obi-Wan, we do get some consistency. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag there. I really appreciate the way Luke and Vader sense one another when Luke gets to Endor. This is something that didn't really get explored much in the prequel trilogy, but does get explored quite a bit in the sequel trilogy. And a lot of the critics of the sequel trilogy, particularly in the relationship between Rey and Kylo Ren, I've heard a lot of criticism about their Force connection, but I feel like a lot of that concept was already present in the original trilogy, as evidenced here between Luke and Vader. And then on Endor, the speeder bikes are just brilliant. Like, looking back on it now, I feel like the pod races were an attempt to kind of recapture the glory of the speeders, but they didn't really do it justice. Regardless of the pod races, though, the speeders are just perfect. I love the fact that they climb on it, turn it on, and boom, they're just gone. Like, the instant propulsion and the high-speed race through the trees, that just added so much excitement. And then we get the Ewoks. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, yeah, Wookiees would have been better. But honestly, I like the Ewoks. I like the way that they're developed here, their superstitious nature, the way they are kind of primitive, and yet they're clearly intelligent. These aren't the Gungans. They're not made to be super goofy. And so even though they are clearly aimed to make this more child-friendly, I feel like they were developed well and are still quite enjoyable. And they serve to add a quirkiness to the movie which is fitting with the rest of Star Wars. And I really appreciate the deification of C-3PO here. And I especially find it really interesting the way the Ewoks worship him, and yet at the same time don't necessarily believe him. But then even more, once everybody is freed, I loved how vindictive R2-D2 was. Like, he turns and starts shocking the Ewoks around him. And that to me just was such a great character moment. It's very small, very simple, but very effective. And one piece of character development that I found quite interesting was it's revealed that Palpatine already knows about the rebels showing up on Endor's moon. And Vader mentions that he sensed Luke there. And then Palpatine questions him about it because Palpatine didn't sense him. But the fact is, Vader was right. Like, I really appreciated that subtle shift in power dynamic. And that may be the first moment that's really hinting at Vader questioning Palpatine. So even though we don't actually see Vader questioning him, there has to be something in his mind that says, you know what, I sensed Luke and Palpatine didn't. There's something off there. And then watching the Ewoks fight the Empire, admittedly was pretty goofy, but at the same time, if it works for Rambo, why not here? Now, I would have bought a lot of it if it was Wookiees using primitive technology to fight. Some of it, like the logs smashing the AT-STs, that was a bit too much, and I wouldn't have bought it regardless of what species was doing it. But the fact is that, as goofy as it is, I do think a bit of it works. A lot of it doesn't, but some of it does. But ultimately, the fact that a number of Ewoks get massacred, I think helps tone down the goofiness in showing, yes, this is going to work to a degree, but they're still going to suffer heavy losses in the process. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I really appreciate the Force connection between Luke and Vader. And the thing is that this movie shows a strong telepathic and empathic connection. And we don't really get that much, if at all, in the prequel trilogy. Now, they do lean into that pretty heavily in the sequel trilogy, which I very much appreciate. But I would have enjoyed if they had delved into that a bit more in the prequel trilogy to show that as a consistent Jedi ability. Or at the very least, show it with Anakin a bit more. But then, when Luke and Vader are fighting, when it gets to the moment that Vader is going to have his hand cut off, he just throws himself onto the rail in a way that does not look natural at all. I really wish that they could have cut that differently or refilmed it to make it look a bit more natural. Because as it is, it looks like he just kind of throws himself down. One of the ideas that was presented in Rise of the Skywalker is that the Emperor wanted Rey to kill him so that he could transfer his spirit to Rey. And there was a lot of talk that this is what the Emperor wanted from Luke, is for Luke to strike down the Emperor so that the Emperor could then take over Luke's body. But we don't see anything even remotely like that here. The Emperor kept wanting Luke to strike down Vader, but then once Luke did overpower Vader, the Emperor turned and started using the Force lightning on him, and it was very clear he was going to kill Luke. So while that may have been a bit of a retcon in Rise of Skywalker, I still don't feel like it works. It just doesn't fit with what we actually see. Like, the only thing that actually stops him from killing Luke is Vader stepping in. And the thing that makes it a bit more believable for me that Vader would turn on the Emperor and actually redeem himself to some degree is that telepathic and empathic connection that he had with Luke. Like, I feel like that Force connection developed their personal connection to the point that that redemption works. Whereas if we hadn't had that, this moment would have kind of felt like it came out of nowhere for me. Now, putting aside the fact that the entire galaxy would not learn immediately that the Emperor died and the Death Star was destroyed, I do really appreciate that in the special editions they added in celebration sequences from a bunch of different planets celebrating the destruction of the Empire. even if it does feel a little bit disjointed, especially considering a lot of these planets we haven't really seen or we haven't seen in quite a while. But adding them in here does serve to tie in the Return of the Jedi back with the prequel trilogy and tie together all 6 movies. That being said, the new music sucks, and they absolutely should not have replaced the original music at the end of the movie. I think that original music is very iconic and perfectly fits, whereas this new music just doesn't really fit the tone of the scene even. And on the note of the special edition changes, I understand why people don't like the way they changed out the original actor for Anakin for Hayden Christensen, but for the sake of the Skywalker saga and all 6 movies maintaining some continuity, I think it makes sense, and I actually kind of appreciate it. And the thing is that the actor that played Anakin in that last sequence had never been on screen, at least not looking like that, to the point that it might not be entirely clear who that's supposed to be. But putting Hayden Christensen there, it makes perfect sense, and thus you know, okay, this is supposed to be Anakin. So while yes, it might look better to have the original actor there, this is one change I'm actually okay with. Overall, I felt like this was a very fitting conclusion for the original trilogy, and even beyond that, a very fitting conclusion for the entirety of the Skywalker saga. This feels like a very strong end cap for the 5 movies that came before it. I don't feel like there are any significant plot threads that are not coming to a conclusion here that needs to be explored later on. Like if I was an author writing these as a series of books, this would be the end of the story. And I do have more to say on that point, but you'll have to come back for the next video where I reflect on the original trilogy and the Skywalker saga as a whole up until this point. But until then, this is Uncle Joel saying, stay tangible.